preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening. Thank you very much for your introduction, and thank you for inviting me to the Y. The topic of my lecture is the neurobiology of emotions and of consciousness, and it really relates to three questions. How does the brain of a living organism allow us to have emotions, to feel those emotions, and to know that we have those feelings of emotions, which is really to say, to have consciousness of emotion and feeling? Now, as you know, these questions are not new. They're questions that have been central in the history of philosophy, and that in fact were being asked 2,500 years ago in the tradition of Western thought, and in fact were receiving very good answers, although by no means definitive answers. They were in fact approximations to the questions, approximations to the answers as well. It's true to say, though, that since the brain has been factored in the way in which we produce the answers to these questions, the answers have gotten better. And for instance, when we look to 100 years ago and we think that questions surrounding emotion were actually receiving very interesting treatments in the thoughts of Darwin, of Freud, of William James, we actually can imagine that if only neuroscience had not turned its back on these questions during the 20th century, we probably would have solved a good part of the puzzles that surrounded these questions. Unfortunately, that was not the case, and throughout most of the 20th century, neuroscience turned its back on the topic of emotion and feeling. I could spend a whole evening telling you why I think neuroscience was not interested in pursuing these questions, but very briefly, I think it mostly had to do with the fact that the questions were far too subjective for the taste of science. And there was a quite understandable desire to pursue topics that can be regarded as more objective, and the fact that all of this was happening in the mind and was very interior, very personal, was a barrier, and still is a barrier in some ways. And so neuroscience turned its back on emotion, but the good news is that in spite of that, and in spite of the fact that during the 20th century, certain things that go with emotion and go with consciousness were always also ignored. For instance, the notion that we have an organism as opposed to having a disembodied brain or a disembodied mind, or the notion that the organism we have is the result of a long history of evolution rather than appearing ready-made out of some engineer's design. In spite of all that, the good news is that there is, especially over the last 10 years, a new interest on the topic of emotion, on the topic of feeling, and on the topic of consciousness. You may want to know why is it that there is this new fervor on all these topics, and why are they now in favor and in fact literally on the first ranks of the agenda of science. And probably the answer is that several things have happened in parallel. One, we have had an enormous explosion in our knowledge of biology, and within biology, knowledge of neurobiology in particular. Another is that the discipline of psychology in all of its aspects has also grown tremendously. We now call it cognitive science, but of course it is simply the extension of what once was known as psychology. And the social sciences have been contributing also very important new findings. And so now we have an opportunity that is really new. It's the opportunity of bringing together knowledge from biology, neurobiology, psychology, and social sciences, and have all this knowledge to help us solve problems that have to do with emotion, feeling, and consciousness. And it is probably the fact that we have that opportunity and that in fact the techniques are available, and I will show you a little bit of results from some of those, that probably has allowed us to make progress. The other thing too is that of course our theoretical progress has been remarkable, and so it is possible now to look at these questions with greater attention. One thing that I would like to say is that it is not just the fact that the 20th century neglected emotion, feeling, and consciousness that joins them in my lecture tonight. Is the fact that they are in fact sort of joined at the base. They are joined physiologically in a very, very strong way. In other words, I will tell you, and maybe I cannot convince you in 45 minutes, but I might, if you read everything that is connected with these ideas. I would like to suggest that emotion and feeling are in fact part and parcel of the mechanisms that allow us to know that we have not only emotion and feeling, but everything else. They are part and parcel of the mechanisms of consciousness. Now, I would like to begin by giving you a very brief definition of emotion and going on to define further what is feeling and how is it that we can understand how the brain ends up producing consciousness. So let me start with the definition to put it in place. And the first element of the definition is that emotions are collections of responses. If I could have just a little bit less light on me, I would have a chance of seeing the audience, and I miss the audience. Good. Now you're coming into life. The first element in the definition, emotions are not simple reflex responses. They're not like a knee-jerk. They're not something simple. They're always a collection of responses. And those responses are extremely rich, and they appear in the form of chemical responses as well as responses that go alongside neural channels, like alongside a nerve pathway. And this is very important because, in fact, when we look in evolution at what may have produced the mechanisms of emotion that we have today, it is quite likely, in fact certain, that emotion was first operated in a living organism by chemical responses. Because in fact emotion was probably present in organisms that didn't even have a brain, didn't even have a nervous system to organize the process of emotion. So the chemical responses in a very simple organism are very much a part of what ends up generating an emotion. And then, of course, there are responses that go alongside nerve channels. Second thing is that when we have an emotion, think of something like fear or happiness or anger, and numerous others that you could call to mind. Those responses are extremely old in evolution. They're not human alone. They have in fact been present for a long time in the history of evolution. Many organisms, both complex and relatively simple, have those kinds of responses. Things that you will recognize are similar to what happens when we have fear or when we have happiness, for example. And one thing is true, is that those responses obviously appeared in evolution. In other words, they were selected and prevailed because they gave an advantage to the organism that exhibited those responses. In other words, we do not have emotions as a luxury. It's not something that you can have or not have. It is not something that you can do without. It is something that has been implanted in our organisms by evolution to produce an extremely advantageous result. It is true, and we could have an interesting discussion about the fact that sometimes emotions are excessive and sometimes they are inconvenient and sometimes we wish we wouldn't have them at a certain point. But that doesn't deny the fact that at the root, these are extremely adaptive processes that give an advantage to the organism that is having those particular processes. One other thing that is important to note is that they are automatic and they are in fact triggered non-consciously. So it is perfectly correct to say that you may know why you have a certain emotion and that you know what caused it. But it is also possible that you have an emotion and eventually a feeling without knowing why you are having it. The beginning of the process may entirely escape your consciousness. And the other thing that is quite clear is that the process is automatic. It is a process that is extremely difficult to control, which is, of course, one of the reasons why sometimes one has problems with one's emotions. And the other thing that is very fundamental is that once you have an emotion, you change in a very dramatic way both the brain and the body. So once you begin the process of emotion, there are enormous changes that happen in the brain, in certain areas of the brain. In other words, it comes from a part of the brain towards other parts of the brain as a process, but then the body changes as well in a very dramatic way. So you have this very complex set of phenomena. There's absolutely nothing simple about it. There's nothing at all like a reflex, and yet it is something very old. It is something that has been in existence in the history of living organisms for a long time. So now one could ask the following question. Since emotions are evolutionarily old, and since we obviously share them with so many living creatures around us, why is it that we find emotion and feeling so important in the definition of our own humanity, individually and collectively? And the interesting reason is that emotions and feelings are attached to virtually every object that you can think of, to every object, to every idea, to every situation that you run into in your life. And in fact, what is very reasonable to say is that there's hardly anything in our entire life from very early on that is not marked by emotion and marked by feeling. So the extraordinary importance of emotion and feeling is not from emotion and feeling itself, which is of course a very simple adaptive process that we share with non-humans, but is given by the fact that emotion attaches itself to so much in our life. And of course, it even begins to be attached to a lot without our own knowledge, because we get that from our genome and we get that in our equipment as we are born, so to speak. But very early on in our lives, we're constantly marking all the events, all the ideas, all the objects, the faces, the people, the landscapes around us by certain kinds of emotions, sometimes positive, sometimes negative, sometimes somewhere in between. But we are constantly being affected, and we are affecting all of those objects around us. So all of that, and the fact that emotions, which can be quite external in their manifestation, project themselves into our mind and have a full impact in our minds through the process of feeling, end up giving emotion this very, very special status. So let me now give you some findings and give you some ideas about how we see the process of emotion coming out of a living organism, and specifically coming out of the brain. And I'm going to have the first slide, and I just would like to start with this slide to say one word about the fact that among the many things that have made a difference and have allowed us to understand more about what is going on in our brains, neuroimaging in its many aspects is a very important development. And I wanted to show you this image because it is an image that some of you might think comes from a post-mortem study, from the study obtained at autopsy. But it is not. It's actually a representation of the brain of an entirely living person obtained from magnetic resonance scanning and reconstructed, the brain reconstructed in 3 dimensions at a computer screen. It is in fact a virtual neuroanatomy of the brain of a particular living person. And we can now do these studies. We can look in the screen at the brain. We can split it, slice it, divide it. You're looking here at the right and left hemispheres of a brain. You're looking at a variety of structures that are below the level of the cortex, like, for instance, the brainstem, about which I'm going to say a few words later. And you can study the neuroanatomy in great detail, and you can also study with other forms of imaging, for instance, positron emission tomography, the levels of activity that different parts of the brain may be having in an entirely normal person during a certain task, during a certain mental task or a certain behavior. Moreover, you can study the placement of areas of damage in this brain when you study neurological patients, which also allows you not only to find very well how the behaviors of a certain person relate to the particular area of damage and to the way the systems have been transformed by the damage, but it also allows you to test very specific hypotheses about how certain parts of the brain contribute or not to certain processes, to certain systems of operation in the brain. Now, let's go to this slide, which is really a cartoon. And it's a cartoon so that I can walk you through the way we now look at the mechanisms of emotion and feeling. And here on top, we're going to start our tour, and we start by having you think about some object that you could look at or that you could recall from memory, something, for instance, that you believe would cause fear or that could cause some other emotion, happiness. It doesn't make any difference, any of those. And what is really going to happen in the brain is that once you perceive that object, either in your mind's eye when you're recalling it, or actually if you're looking at the object, that object is going to be detected by a number of structures that we call, in our theoretical framework, emotion induction sites or emotion effector sites. And they are in different parts of the brain for different kinds of emotion. And those regions of the brain are going to engender a very complicated process that we're going to follow by looking at these 3 black arrows and this white arrow. The white arrow is going to end up in this yellow disc, which is going to represent, for the evening, the body. And what we're going to have is that these regions of the brain are going to produce in the body a virtual upheaval. They're going to produce, for instance, certain specific behaviors. For example, you're going to produce a behavior of running away or freezing in the case of fear. Or they're going to produce a nurturing behavior if, in fact, the stimulus was the presence of offspring, or a courting behavior, or behaviors that have to do with anger or with sadness, and so on. So there are going to be a number of changes that occur in the body and that can lead that body to move, to do certain things, the facial expression to change, the posture of the body to change as well, and they are being produced as a stereotyped pattern. They're being produced out of the commands from these regions, and they're being executed in this particular body, which you can see at that point as a sort of symphony orchestra executing that particular score. Now, many things happen as those behaviors are organized. For instance, a variety of chemical molecules are released directly into the bloodstream and go to a variety of tissues all over the body. One example are molecules that function as hormones in our body, and they are released immediately as the process begins, and they can influence not only how certain organs operate in the seconds that follow the release, but also how the tissues in general are going to be ready or not for certain kinds of behavior that follow. The viscera are going to change as well. So the heart rate can change, the blood pressure can change, the gut, the way, the pattern of respiration, the way the blood vessels can contract or dilate in the skin. causing, for instance, people to blush or to blanch. All of those changes occur very rapidly, and so do the musculoskeletal changes that allow us to have an expression of fear or of happiness or of sadness or what have you. So the point to be made here is that there are all of these remarkable changes that take place in the body very rapidly and that constitute an emotional state. And then out of this very complex concert, we're going to get signals being relayed back into the brain towards regions of the brain that can carry a map and form a map of the many different changes that occurred in the body as the emotions set on. So we really have a process, a sort of chain that begins with the detection of some stimulus that can lead to an emotion, then the production of the emotion via mechanisms that are extremely ancient in our evolution and that are carried out largely in the body, but also, as I will say in a second, in the brain. And then you have a final phase in which signals from all of these changes are ferried back into the brain, but into different areas, not the areas that first saw the stimulus, not the areas that initiated the process of emotion, but rather areas that, by virtue of their role in physiology, are looking at the state of the body, at the state of the viscera, at the state of the chemistries all over the body, at the state of the musculoskeletal apparatus. And it is there that we're going to have the substrates for what we call feeling, as opposed to what we call emotion. Now, there are many other things, and I'm not going to have time to tell you all the detail, that can happen out of this blue rectangle over here. For instance, you can change at the same time in certain emotions, you can change the way in which the signals are being phoned back to the brain out of the body. You can also influence directly the way the maps of the body operate during an emotion. And you can also change the way your entire thinking apparatus operates at the moment you are having an emotion. So think about the complexity. Not only is it that once you go into a state of, say, anger, you change the way your body operates, but you also will change the way the brain circuits that support the thinking process operate. So they are going to operate in a different manner. When you are, for instance, in the peak of happiness, they're going to operate very fast. Your attention span is going to change. Your image-making ability is going to increase, and almost the opposite during very deep sadness, and so on. So the point to be made here is that this is, in fact, a very major upheaval to the system, one in which the body changes, but the brain changes as the body changes. And the brain is, at the same time that it changes, collecting a sort of view of the changes of the body. So in the end, having a feeling of an emotion ends up being a way of representing at a given moment the way in which your body has been changed by the presence of a certain stimulus, an object, a situation, an idea, what have you, and also the way in which the entire thinking apparatus has changed at the same time as the body has changed. So if anybody thinks this is simple, you're not paying attention, because there's nothing simple about this. It's extremely complicated, and you can understand, in fact, why there was so much controversy about the process. You know, if you go back 100 years to William James, who happens to be one of my heroes, William James actually placed part of this idea very clearly when he thought that there would be a way in which the body would be influenced by the presence of a stimulus. He didn't know about these areas that we now have identified, but he had the right idea in that the body would be changed, and that it would be out of the perception of body change that we would get a feeling. However, there were several problems with the way James proposed the idea, largely because he concentrated on the viscera. and he ignored the role of the musculoskeletal input. He, of course, did not know much about what was going on in the internal milieu, and he had no way of knowing about all of this adjoining machinery. And between the incompleteness of his formulation and the poor experiments of those who attacked James, the fact is that by the late 20s, the idea that the body was involved in the process had either been totally forgotten or just outright attacked. And in fact, we need to wait 100 years for James to be rescued, because now we do have evidence that favors his views quite clearly. So let me tell you a little bit about what we know, and it's just going to be a sample since we know far too much to give you in just a few minutes. But what do we know about these areas that I call induction and effector sites? We know, for instance, that there are areas in a region such as the amygdala and in several nuclei of a region known as the brainstem, and another region here known as the basal forebrain, and another known as the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, that operate as induction and effector sites. So that really means that these are the areas that recognize a stimulus as belonging to a certain category that ought to produce an emotion, and then command the chain of events, the cascade of phenomena that leads you to be in an emotional state and eventually leads you into the feeling that comes from there. Now, we know a considerable amount now about these regions, and one of the areas where we have known the most over the past 5 years actually comes from studies of patients such as the one that I'm showing you here through the brain of that particular patient. You're looking here at the brain of the patient. It's entirely normal from the outside, but when you section the brain through this plane and you see the slice, you realize that there are two areas there, they're marked as the amygdala, that are very dark. If you now compare it to the way it ought to be in an entirely normal individual, you see that it's very different. This is the normal amygdala. This is the amygdala changed by a disease. It's a neurological disease that specifically targets this structure. And here we've cut it this way, almost horizontally, and you can see that those two black eyes shouldn't be there. It should be gray, like there. By the way, this is a study, again, like I showed you, in an entirely living person. It's non-invasive, it's not painful at all to do, and you're looking at the brain in all its detail, and the detail can be even greater than this. What happens when you have damage in these structures? Something quite interesting. First of all, you lose the ability to recognize fear in the face of others. So if you look at a person who has a face of fear, you just don't have any idea that that facial expression represents fear. Nor do you have the possibility of engendering fear in yourself. When you look at other emotions, for instance, happiness or surprise or sadness, disgust, the person recognizes all those emotions and has all those emotions. So what we're dealing with here is something very telling. It tells you that, number one, as happens in many other aspects of brain function, the functions are segregated by different systems. It is not that we have a grand central system for emotions that can clear all emotions and operate all of them from the same place. Not at all. What we have is an extremely parcellated arrangement in which certain systems with multiple components will generate fear, or will generate anger, or will generate happiness. This, by the way, is exactly what happens when you think about memory or when you think about language. You have different multi-component systems that produce a certain function. They're not single centers, there's nothing phrenological about this, and there's, least of all, centers for all functions. Everything is extremely well designed in terms of an architecture that gives you certain components of function. Now, one thing that is very interesting is that this recognition of faces of a certain emotion that this person and many other patients like her fail completely is something that actually begins by happening non-consciously. So it's perfectly obvious that we can look at somebody who is can look at Janet Leigh in the shower scene in Psycho, and you can see terror in her face. However, that kind of process actually happens subconsciously and in a very interesting way. Let me give you some of the evidence we have for this. For example, if we show faces of fear and we show them very, very fast, such that you have no way you saw a face of fear, and we are studying this structure, the amygdala, with a device like positron emission tomography, which allows us to see the state of activation of that structure, what happens is that the amygdala will be activated, even if you yourself don't know that you've just seen fear, but the amygdala does. So what it means is that you didn't see the face, but your brain processed the face subliminally and activated the amygdala, and in fact is already beginning to initiate a process, is already preparing the organism for a potential reaction that is consonant with that face. Another thing that is quite marvelous, if you look at the face of another person and that face is showing different emotions, like for instance sadness or happiness or fear, and if I now place electrodes in the muscles over your face, such that they can be over the muscles that normally are moved when you show surprise or when you show happiness, for instance, the muscles that raise or lower the corners of your mouth. And if I do that particular placement of electrodes, when you look at a face of sadness, even if your face does not change, the muscles that would produce sadness in your face are already prepared to act, and they immediately go into action. And if I show you a face of happiness, the muscles that would produce the movement of happiness also go into action. And yet you have not produced any movement. Moreover, if I now do it with backward masking, and if you don't have any opportunity of seeing the face, again the same thing happens. So this is quite interesting because it tells you that these systems are so old in evolution that they are here preparing us not only to have the emotions, but actually to be in tune with the emotions of others. This is actually something that is probably very much related to processes of empathy. If you are looking at somebody that is smiling, you are going to be prepared to smile as well. And of course, if you can stand the person, you will find a way of suppressing the smile, which is a good thing. But if you don't, if you happen to like the person, eventually you will smile, which is the reason, of course, why we like to be around happy people, because eventually we smile more. But the important thing is to realize that this is not something that you learn, although, of course, your own history psychologically and your culture can change the way you operate on these systems. There's no doubt about that. But basically, we come equipped with this marvelous system. And this marvelous system helps us, among many things, to be ready to operate not just as individuals, but as individuals in a social context, and will allow us to be able to be in tune with what is happening in the face of another. Now, what happens when you go back into the brain, when you go into the feeling phase? There are other structures, and I'm calling attention here to one structure known as the insula, another known as S2, is one of several somatosensory cortices that actually can pick up on the activity that is going on in the body. And of course, those structures are also in the brainstem region and in the cingulate cortex, and create the substrate for what we call feeling. And here I would like to make two comments and then tell you about a very interesting new experiment from our lab. One is this division between the publicness of emotions and the privacy of feelings. This is something that, first of all, calls for a very systematic separation of the two words, although very often in our common parlance we use one or the other and confuse them. But the fact is that when we have an emotion, we're talking about something that is exhibited in our bodies, exhibited in the expression of our faces, and it really aims at the outside. It's something that changes our body, gets it ready to act in an appropriate context, and also signals quite a lot of information to others that are around us. When we have feelings, we have something that happens in the interior. It is something that is entirely private, happens in the first person. Only we know about our feelings. If I have an emotion, you can perfectly well guess what is in my mind in terms of my feelings, but you don't see my feelings ever. I don't see your feelings ever. They're private. And it is this privacy that I think is extremely important to acknowledge. And it is something actually that has been not just detected by scientists, but has been very much part of poetry and theater. I like to talk about Richard II and the climatic scene with Bolingbroke, when he says that my grief lies all within, and these external manner of laments are just a shadow of the unseen grief. And it's exactly that. What Bolingbroke and the rest of the court is looking at is the emotion of grief that is expressed in those external laments that Shakespeare puts so well. But what Richard is feeling is something very private, is the unseen grief. And so this distinction is quite important. It's important for one more reason, is that when you look at the history of this problem in neurobiology, one of the reasons why, and I alluded to that at the beginning, one of the reasons why science has been cautious with studying emotion and feeling is because feeling is not objective. Feeling is inside. And the fact that the process cannot be seen by others has been considered a limitation. Now, of course, this is a very silly limitation, because when you think of it, all of our mind is private. That's exactly what defines the mind. And there's nothing more private about feeling than any other kind of cognitive process. They're all inside. You only know about it if you're told in relation to another person. Only we know our own ideas, only we know our own thoughts and our own mind. So this has been a problem. And of course, it has also been a problem that people did not know where to look. They kept saying that feelings were very elusive and that you could not find where they were in fact being executed, so to speak, in the brain. So we actually think otherwise, as you can imagine, and we have recently put the notion to test that feelings are in fact based on this marvelous representation of multiple dimensions, multiple aspects of the organism, of the body, as it changes during an emotion. And to make a long story short, I'll tell you that the experiment we did involved over 40 entirely normal individuals, men and women, adults, without any history of neurological or psychiatric problem. And they were asked to conjure up very powerful emotions and reenact emotions coming from a very powerful emotional episode in their own past. So this is something like an actor studio technique. We were really asking entirely normal non-actors to think about an incredibly sad episode of their lives, bring back images of that particular episode, and then go through it and try to relive the emotion of that moment. And then, once the person was feeling the emotion, a signal would be raised saying, I'm feeling the emotion, and the person would be scanned in a positron emission tomography, which allows you to see where the activity is in different regions. And we had a very strict hypothesis about the areas that ought to be activated or deactivated and the areas that ought not to change. And the areas that we were, of course, concentrating on are areas that are very important to look at the body, the areas that map how the body as a whole is operating. And what I'm going to show, I'm just going to show you 2 or 3 of these results. First, let me tell you that the hypothesis was quite supported by the study. This has just been published 3 weeks ago in Nature Neuroscience. And what I'm going to show you is a variety of slices of the brain, all taken in an horizontal direction. And I'm going to show you slices that have to do with the emotion sadness, and some that have to do with the emotion happiness, so that we don't end emotions on a bad note. So here we have several slices that have to do with sadness, and these slices here, these 4, are taken along those black lines, the horizontal lines. And although I'm not going to try to make neuroscientists out of you, I can tell you that the areas that are red, like here, or here, are areas that are very intensely activated. Areas that are in the purple colors are areas that are deactivated. In other words, the brain is working less here than in here. But the very important point that I can tell you is that these regions here, which are all regions that map the state of the body, or this region here, or these regions here that are marked IN, which stands for insula, are areas that are extremely activated. So in an area like this, for instance, you're getting signals that come from the viscera, from the heart, from the gut, from the lungs, signals that tell us about what is going on in the chemistries of the body, from the pressure of O2 and CO2 to the pH in the bloodstream, and on and on. So you have enormous sets of maps that are literally mapping the body at that particular moment. And the interesting thing is that here we are in this state of sadness and having all of these different spots which are maps of the body and that are altered dramatically in relation to the condition that this is being contrasted to. Let me just tell you, because this is interesting, that was sadness, and I'm showing you an image that comes from a study that is not from our laboratory. It's from a laboratory by a colleague, Wayne Dravitz, at the University of Pittsburgh, who studied the changes that occur in patients with depression. And in fact, as it turns out, that precisely that same area that I pointed to you, that is so important in the definition of the map of sadness in an entirely normal individual, is an area that is very altered in terms of not only its structure, but also the way it reacts in an imaging experiment in patients with depression. So this is interesting, and I would like to make 2 comments about this. First, look at how remarkable it is that an area that is involved in the brain of someone with chronic depression can be also altered momentarily, in fact, in a matter of 2 minutes at the most, in somebody who is entirely normal, who does not have a depression, but who is at that point sad and in fact crying, thinking about a particular event of the past. So this tells you that there is a remarkable coincidence here between the momentary sadness of a normal individual and the chronic sadness that is part of the syndrome of depression. But this also has another practical effect that I would like to call your attention to, is that studies like this, which are of course very interesting from the point of view of our human curiosity about how we are the way we are, have also a practical value, is that they allow us to study in greater detail how these systems in the brain operate these different aspects of emotion and feeling, and eventually how given further knowledge of the anatomy and the physiology and the pharmacology, how you can design medical interventions that will be more specific and that can help human suffering, which is in fact quite remarkable in terms of the diseases that affect the emotions. So just to go on to the positive note now, here's happiness for you. And happiness, again, involves many structures that are looking at the body, for instance, the insula, for instance, this area known as S2, somatosensory secondary cortex, on the right in particular. And there's this area here which begins to be for us a sort of signature of the feeling of happiness state, which is in the posterior cingulate and is actually quite remarkable. So, what we can, and I could show you images of fear and of many other emotions, but I won't. I'd just like to close this section before I make comments on consciousness by telling you that where we stand right now is that we're beginning to have a pretty good understanding of the general architecture of the system that operates emotions. We don't know by any means the architecture for all emotions, but we know for some of the primary emotions like emotion, fear, happiness, sadness, incompletely, but we're getting there. We're beginning to understand a little bit about other emotions, the so-called social or secondary emotions, things like pride, embarrassment, guilt, and so on. And one thing that I wanted to say before I move on to further comments on consciousness is that you might think, as I gave you this cartoon and this idea that we have this very strictly organized arrangement that was given by evolution, that you had very little way of intervening on it. You get your emotions, you go through life, you mark events with emotions, and there you have it. And by no means do I think that. I did refer to the fact that one's individual development, one's individual social and cultural context play a considerable role in how you can manipulate the attachments you have. And so this slide is just here to remind me to tell you that. And all of this blue around the cartoon, which is marked here modulatory sites, is just to tell you that there are a number of structures in the human brain, for instance in the prefrontal cortex, that are especially tuned to picking up on a variety of cues that come from our own learning in a social context, for instance, that will operate will operate on the machinery of emotions and can in fact operate at the level we process a given object that could cause emotion, at the level of the induction of the emotions, and even in the way in which the feeling itself is operated. So one's learning, one's development through life has an opportunity of intervening on the process by which you connect certain emotions and feelings to certain objects, certain situations, and certain ideas. And that is obviously the case. You could say that, for instance, all of the efforts of psychoanalysis are in fact directed at trying to intervene in this mechanism precisely from this surround of learned connections between the emotional apparatus and the world that we have come to experience. It's just that we certainly know far less about how you can intervene on the core machinery than about the core machinery, which is, of course, something that should not be surprising. Now, so we come to this point, and we can say that we, as living organisms, have certain aspects of our brain that are concerned with basic life regulation, things, for instance, that give us reflexes, the ability to regulate our metabolism, the ability to have pain and pleasure states, drives, motivations, and so on, which are very basic, very simple, but are in fact providing us with a way to survive. And these are of course, sets of structures that are given to us in the genome that are set in a rather strict way in our nervous systems and operate over the entire organism for survival purposes. And they have to be very strict, because if they weren't, our chances of dying would be, of course, extremely high. Then we have two levels of regulation, emotions and feeling, which come on top of this basic life regulation. And we saw how emotions are no longer simple but rather complex, although they're still stereotyped. And of course, just like this set of basic regulators, emotions have a purpose. They have this purpose, which we talked about, which is to produce some kind of response that is advantageous to the individual that exhibits that particular emotion, and therefore can lead to a better chance of survival. Now comes the level of feelings, which we just discussed, and the question might be asked, if you have machinery that allows you to emote and thus have an advantage, why should you, on top of it, represent the results in a feeling state? Does that give you any additional advantage? And the answer is yes, it does. And the advantage is that it makes a greater impact on the mind. And probably from an evolutionary standpoint, and by no means do I know that this is the case, but it's plausible, it's quite likely that we had organisms for a long time that stopped here and that had basic life regulation and emotions and got along perfectly fine with this arrangement.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.